Beneath the soil of the world's second-largest continent sits the future of the global economy. Cobalt for the battery in your phone, lithium for the car in your driveway, uranium for warheads on 3 continents, and control of a stretch of ocean that carries a massive share of the planet's trade. This is Africa. And right now, 3 of the most powerful nations on Earth are locked in a quiet war to control it. A war fought not with declarations, but with loans, mercenaries, and military bases hidden in plain sight. Most of the world isn't watching. It should be. To understand why, start with the numbers. By 2050, roughly 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. The continent's population is younger than any other, its cities are growing faster than any other, and its workforce is set to become the largest on the planet within a generation. That growth carries risk as well as promise. Where economies fail to create enough jobs for young populations, extremist groups and armed factions find fertile ground for recruitment. One more reason outside powers now compete as much for stability as for raw resources. But it isn't only people that make Africa the prize of this century. It's what lies beneath the ground. More than half of the world's cobalt, the mineral that makes modern batteries possible, comes from a single country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Africa also holds vast reserves of lithium, uranium, platinum, gold, and oil, along with rare earth minerals that modern militaries and modern economies cannot function without. Then there's geography. Africa's coastline commands the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the approach to the Suez Canal, the passage through which an enormous share of the world's shipping must travel. Whoever controls these waters holds real leverage over global trade itself. Put people, minerals, and geography together, and you get a continent that has quietly become the most contested piece of real estate on Earth. Over the last 2 decades, China, Russia, and the United States have each moved from trading partner to military player on African soil, and the competition between them is only accelerating. China moved first, and it moved with money. Starting in the early 2000s, Beijing began pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into African roads, railways, power plants, and ports under the banner of the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese state-owned firms have financed, built, or taken a stake in dozens of ports across the continent, from the Horn of Africa to the Atlantic coast, giving Beijing influence over the physical infrastructure that African trade depends on. In 2018, China hosted African leaders at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation and unveiled a security action plan calling for dozens of new programs to deepen military and policing ties across the continent, from joint training exercises to law enforcement forums. State-linked Chinese firms now spend billions of dollars a year on security services worldwide, a large share of it protecting Chinese investments inside Africa itself. The pitch to African governments was simple. Get the roads and railways you desperately need without the political conditions that often come attached to Western loans. Critics call it something else: debt trap diplomacy. The accusation is that China offers financing many nations cannot realistically repay, and when the debt comes due, Beijing gains leverage over strategic assets instead of its money back. Djibouti, on the Horn of Africa, is the clearest example. A majority of its external debt is owed to Chinese lenders, and Chinese-linked companies dominate its ports. China insists this is partnership, not conquest, investment the West failed to offer for decades. Its rivals call it a slow, patient method of buying influence, one loan at a time. Whichever version is closer to the truth, the results are the same. Beijing built an economic empire in Africa without firing a single shot. Then, in 2017, China took a step it had never taken anywhere else in the world. It opened an overseas military base, its first. The location was Djibouti, a small nation on the Horn of Africa that also happens to host military installations from the United States, France, Japan, and several other powers, all crowded onto the same strip of coastline. China's base sits just miles from a port its own companies helped build. Reports describe a dock capable of servicing warships and submarines, underground facilities, space for helicopters, and infrastructure to support unmanned aircraft. Officially, the base exists to support anti-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Aden and to protect the growing number of Chinese citizens and businesses operating across Africa. Unofficially, it gave the Chinese Navy something it had never possessed before: a permanent foothold far from its own coastline, positioned at one of the most strategically vital choke points on Earth. For Washington, watching a Chinese military base rise a short distance from its own installation in Djibouti was a wake-up call. The competition for Africa had stopped being purely economic. It had become military. Where China brought money, Russia brought guns. And for years, it hid them behind a mask. That mask was the Wagner Group, a private mercenary force that fought across Mali, the Central African Republic, Libya, and Sudan, while the Kremlin officially denied any connection to it at all. Wagner's model was transactional. Fighters propped up fragile governments and juntas in exchange for access to gold mines and other resources, giving Moscow influence on the ground while keeping its hands officially clean. That arrangement collapsed in 2023. Wagner's founder led a short-lived mutiny against the Russian military, and weeks later died when his plane crashed under circumstances still debated to this day. In the aftermath, the Kremlin absorbed what remained of Wagner's African operations into something new: the Africa Corps, a paramilitary force placed directly under Russia's Ministry of Defense. The mission stayed largely the same: train local armies, guard resource sites, prop up governments aligned with Moscow. But the deniability was gone. When fighters linked to the Africa Corps are accused of abuses, the accusation now lands squarely on the Russian state. And the accusations have been serious. Human rights investigators have documented executions, disappearances, and burned villages linked to Russian-backed forces operating in Mali since 2024, including the deaths of civilians in a drone strike and the killing of women and a young child during one operation in early 2025. Today, Russian personnel operate across a belt of unstable states stretching from West Africa to the Red Sea. In Mali, Africa Corps fighters back a military junta fighting an Islamist insurgency that has gone as far as blockading fuel supplies into the capital, Bamako. In the Central African Republic and Libya, Russian forces guard political leaders and resource sites. In Burkina Faso and Niger, nations that expelled French and American forces after coups, Russian personnel arrived almost as soon as the West left. There are reports of Russian trainers in Equatorial Guinea, a coup-installed government in Madagascar reportedly courting Moscow, and a new military cooperation agreement with Togo that may open the door to port access on West Africa's coast. In Sudan, torn apart by civil war, Russia has reportedly pursued naval access along the Red Sea coast, a foothold that would put Moscow within reach of one of the most valuable shipping lanes on the planet. And behind the visible fighters, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service has quietly taken over something else: a network of political consultants running disinformation and influence campaigns across the continent, shaping opinion in Moscow's favor, while the world's attention stays fixed on the mercenaries. The United States, in many ways, got to Africa before either of its rivals, at least militarily. Washington's base in Djibouti, established in 2002, predates China's by 15 years. For 2 decades after the September 11th attacks, American strategy on the continent was built almost entirely around counterterrorism, hunting al-Shabaab in Somalia and confronting al-Qaeda and Islamic State affiliates spreading across the Sahel. But that model has been unraveling. In 2024, American forces completed a full withdrawal from Niger, once home to a major U.S. drone base, after a military junta seized power and pivoted toward Moscow. American troop numbers in Somalia have been cut sharply as well. The era of large, semi-permanent American bases scattered across the continent is giving way to something leaner. Fewer boots on the ground, more targeted strikes when a direct threat emerges, and a growing emphasis on competing for the same resources drawing in China and Russia. There are early signs of what this shift looks like in practice. The United States has explored minerals for security arrangements with the Democratic Republic of Congo, offering investment and support against armed groups in exchange for greater access to the country's cobalt and other reserves, a notable departure from a strategy once built almost entirely around chasing militants. Washington has not gone quiet. In 2026 alone, American forces have carried out strikes against Islamic State commanders in Nigeria and al-Shabaab fighters in Somalia. But every American withdrawal leaves a vacuum. And in Niger, in the Sahel, in country after country, it is China and Russia moving fastest to fill it.
All three powers now collide in the same pressure points. The Sahel has become a corridor of coups, where French and American influence has collapsed almost entirely, and Russian mercenaries have rushed in to fill the vacuum, even as insurgent groups tighten their grip around capital cities. The Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden have become a battleground in their own right. Houthi attacks on shipping threaten the very trade routes that make this region so valuable in the first place, and every major power now keeps ships or bases nearby to protect its interests. Sudan's civil war has turned into a proxy conflict, with outside powers reportedly circling its Red Sea coastline, eyeing a naval foothold on one of the world's most valuable waterways. And deep in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the race for cobalt and other critical minerals pulls in Chinese mining conglomerates, Western technology companies, and armed groups, all fighting over the same mountains of ore. These are not separate conflicts playing out by coincidence. They are different fronts of the same global contest.
Strip away the flags, the mercenaries, and the military bases, and the contest comes back to the same resource again and again: critical minerals. The cobalt in your smartphone, the lithium in an electric vehicle battery, the rare earth elements inside a missile guidance system or a wind turbine. Nearly all of it depends, in some form, on African supply chains. China moved early to lock down mining rights and processing capacity across the continent, giving it a dominant position in refining materials the rest of the world still relies on. The United States and its allies are now scrambling to catch up, pursuing new mineral partnerships and investment deals with African governments that Washington largely ignored for decades. This is the quiet engine underneath everything else in this story. Not just influence for its own sake, but a race to control the raw materials the next century of technology and warfare will run on.
None of this is happening to Africa without Africa's own hand in the game. African leaders are not passive bystanders. Many are deliberately playing outside powers against one another, extracting better terms from each. A government frustrated with Chinese loan conditions can turn to Gulf or Western investors. A junta unhappy with Western pressure over democracy can invite Russian trainers instead. The African Union has pushed for a stronger, more unified voice in negotiations with outside powers, and some of the continent's largest economies, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, are positioning themselves as regional powers in their own right, courted by all sides rather than dominated by any single one. This is the paradox at the heart of the story. Great power competition can be exploited by African governments as much as it exploits them. The outcome, in many cases, will depend less on decisions made in Washington, Moscow, or Beijing, and more on the choices African leaders make about who they let in, on what terms, and for how long.
This is not a war for African territory the way empires once fought for colonies. It is a war for access. Access to minerals, to ports, to governments willing to align with one power over another. For African nations themselves, this competition is not purely a curse. Multiple suitors can mean better infrastructure deals and more leverage than any single dominant partner would ever offer. But it also means African soil becoming the stage on which outside powers settle their own rivalries, often at the cost of African debt, African instability, and African lives. The 21st century's balance of power may not be decided only in Washington, Moscow, or Beijing. It may be decided in Bamako, in Djibouti, in Kinshasa, in the ports, the mines, and the military camps of a continent the rest of the world spent decades underestimating. 3 powers, 1 continent, and a contest that is only just beginning, where every conflict has a cause, every border has a cost, and every war leaves something behind.